Well, let me be the first to potentially welcome all of our northern brothers and sisters to the Union. That's right. According to Donald Trump, we are in serious negotiations to determine whether or not Canada becomes the 51st state. But that's only because you finally got rid of Trudeau. I'm going to be honest. I know everyone at this table is thrilled that Canada is no longer being ruled by a member of the Castro family. But that leaves a lot of questions on what's going to happen next, not to mention some questions on how did Canada get to this place? Because Canada is an incredible country, but there's some really significant problems going on right now. And what we're going to do today is we're going to analyze just how much of that is as a result of Justin Trudeau's policies. And we're going to discuss what happens next. You know, what happened? Who's going to be the next Prime Minister of Canada? And what will U.S.-Canadian relations really look like? Now, somebody once said that Trump should be taken seriously, but not always literally, because he does a lot of negotiations. And so throwing certain concepts out there to see what happens next is a big part of what he does. And we've seen this not only with discussions about tariffs, but also with discussions about, hey, why don't you guys just join the United States? So let's take a look today on how Canada got to where it currently is at, where it's going, who's going to lead it next, and is it actually possible that Canada could finally become a part of the United States of America? All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio today, Lagatha, destroyer of worlds, pillager of English monasteries, and just adorable, if I do say so myself. Also, my beautiful bride, Tina, queen of the bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. So you really wanted to jump into this whole question of what's going on in Canada. And because I had an outline, Christian and I had a bit of a fight over this because I wanted to talk about the UK gang story, which we are also probably going to get to at some point. But there's a lot developing right there that I think we kind of want to wait to develop a little bit more before we kind of do a comprehensive analysis of it. But we also wanted to talk about this. And a lot of times our audience is like, why are we talking about, stuff outside the United States? Because it's meaningful. And because a lot of the things that we see taking place in places like the UK and Canada are based off of similar issues that we're seeing here in the United States, whether it's inflationary monetary policy, government interventionism, immigration policy, wokeism, like all of this stuff is playing out and not just the United States. And a lot of times it's interesting to see the different places that other countries which share a common culture with the United States, what is happening there. And Canada is probably one of the most relevant examples because it's one of our biggest trading partners. It's our neighbor to the north. So let's kind of jump into this, and again, eventually ask the question. Lagatha's very upset; she wants to run around. But eventually, ask the question of: do we really think it's possible that Canada can become part of the United States? And I will tell you, one of the things that I am going to be looking for on whether or not I honestly believe this is a genuine possibility is, are we dressed for the occasion? Because if this comes down to a conflict where we have to actually take Canada, we want to make sure that we're dressed to impress. And True Classic has expanded. It used to be about the T-shirts, people. It used to be about the True Classic T-shirts, how well they fit, how good they made you feel. Because let's face it, guys, we don't have T-shirts that cater to us until now. But now True Classic has an entire wardrobe available for you. They did T-shirts so well, they said, hey, let's go ahead and expand into other areas, maybe like the United States will be doing here shortly. So they not only have the T-shirts, but they have the jeans, they have the khakis, they have the shorts, they have the workout gear, they have the underwear, which fits beautifully, I might add. And they have the various hoodies and stuff that we as Americans may need to go up and welcome our brothers in a much colder climate into the United States of America. So go over to trueclassic.com. Here's what I want you to do. You're going to go to trueclassic.com/Nick. Go look at the bundles that they offer, right? Like, yeah, you want to go and buy one T-shirt, go buy one T-shirt. But I'm telling you right now, you're going to really appreciate buying a bundles, a couple different clothes. Me personally, I love the T-shirts. I love the workout gear. The hoodies are great. They have a whole button down, like it's a, easy, comfortable button down collection now as well. If you're more of a T-shirt guy like me, but you need something formal, go on there and try those. I'm promising you're going to love them. Anyways. Now, let's talk about Canada. So,
hold on. Straight out of the gate, we've got a question already from Darth Amalgamation.
Oh, gosh.
And he wants to know, or she, I don't know if this is a man or a woman,
wow.
but
With
So-
a name like that, I'm willing to bet a man.
Probably
No,
a dude.
it's
It's
definitely
probably
a
a
chick.
dude. Anyway, he said, is there any legitimate way we could prevent Canadians from voting in federal elections if we annex them?
Whoa.
We got to save that for the end.
You can't just jump to the end there, Darth. I mean, we got to talk. Look,
I'm just taking the questions as they roll in.
Alberta's allowed to vote. Quebec is not.
We'll answer these type of questions at the end. Don't worry.
All
don't worry.
right. So let's jump into this first and foremost because we kind of we need to lay out a little bit about the Justin Trudeau era because that has really led us to where Canada and where we are today. So let's go ahead and start there about the ascendancy of Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. So, long story short, right before we started recording, I was telling Nick and Tina a brief story of my last year in college. So, I remember this was in the fall of 2015. I was in my apartment. This is in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I was finishing up my last year at JMU. You were busy running for the House of Delegates, about to get elected to your first term. And one of my roommates was watching John Oliver because he was, of course, a leftist. And I remember sitting down and watching this clip of him. And he was explaining the upcoming election in Canada that was to take place in 2015. And basically, the entire clip was a total shill ad for Justin Trudeau, who I had never heard of before as an American. I didn't know who he was. I barely knew that there was an election that was going on in our neighbor to the north of us at the time. And I remember at the end of that, and I was already on the right.
Yeah.
But I remember at the end of that clip, I was just thinking to myself, this guy is an idiot, and he's going to destroy this entire country if he gets elected as prime minister. And lo and behold,
you weren't convinced that socialist Kendall was going to save
no.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so long story short, my fears came to pass. I've got a couple quick links up here that I just want to run people through. Not because I love Wikipedia, but just because I want to illustrate to the audience the political trajectory that Canada went through over the last 3 cycles. So here's the first one. This is the 2015 election where Trudeau defeated the Harper government. They were the incumbent conservative government that was running the country for many years.
And won significantly.
He won overwhelmingly, actually. So before Trudeau came along, and Trudeau's the son of a former prime minister as well.
Well, allegedly. He was partially raised by a former prime minister.
So Trudeau was took over a party that was in shambles. Really, I mean, they only had 36 seats going into this election. The official opposition, or actually, it was historically unprecedented. The official opposition were actually the New Democratic Party, which is really their socialist party. That is not normally the trend.
Yeah.
I think it was Jack Layton, who was the head of the NDP, did a really good job in the previous election. He passed away immediately afterwards. He was replaced by Tom Mulcair, who had no clue what he was doing. Mulcair ended up fumbling the ball, and Trudeau picked up the ball to represent the left wing and ended up running it across the finish line and defeating Stephen Harper in a pretty convincing victory. Overwhelming. He won by about 8 points. He got an absolute governing majority, 184 seats. And if you actually look at the...
Now, keep in mind, again, for people in the United States, we're used to seeing red associated with the Conservative Party. We're like the only country in the world that does that. Red is always associated with the left in the vast majority of places, and blue is always associated with the right, just so we're clear.
Yeah, and when you look at the election results that took place in Canada that year, it was pretty overwhelming. So again, red is the Liberals, blue is the Conservatives, orange is the NDP, which is their far left socialist party, and then these tiny, turquoise, teal colors, those are that's the Bloc. That's the Canadians, the Quebec separatists. And so you can see that the Liberals dominated in most of these metro areas, right? Toronto, they won in a landslide. Southern Ontario, the Vancouver area, they completely routed the Conservatives in the maritime provinces. So like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. Really, the Conservatives just really ran up the score in
Alberta,
Alberta's like the Texas of Canada. Yeah. So it was a pretty convincing victory for Trudeau. And then 4 years later, he ran for another term and he won again. Although it's worth noting that he did not have a majority government. And in fact, he technically did not win a majority of the popular vote. So he had a minority government, and this is in 2019. He won a second term. But he didn't get a majority of the seats in the Canadian Parliament. And so he had to more or less form an informal governing agreement with this man, Jagmeet Singh, who leads, again, the socialists in Canada. But again, when you look at the map, it's relatively the same, except you see that the bloc grows. They pick up some more seats in Quebec. The Conservatives pick up a few more seats in the western part of the country. But again, they can't really make any breakthroughs in the big urban areas. And so even though the Liberals actually lose the popular vote to the Conservatives, there is no way for the Conservatives to form a majority government because it's all left-wing parties that are the third, minor party. So Trudeau stays on as prime minister. Well,
so this is an interesting dynamic too. Again, in the United States, we're used to with the Electoral College and whatnot. Democrats, there's never been a case that I'm aware of in recent American history, if ever, where the Republicans won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. But in this case, obviously Canada doesn't have an Electoral College, but they won the popular vote, but they didn't get the governing majority because, again, this is in a parliamentary system. The parties get their votes, they get certain seats allotted, and then you select, the leader of the party generally becomes the prime minister.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon in some of these competitive districts for somebody to win a seat with like literally 35, 36% of the vote. Because you could have, especially if you're in a place like Quebec, you could have like 4 or 5 major parties competing for one what they call ridings in Canada. They're parliamentary seats. And so then you had COVID happen. We're going to get to COVID actually near the end of the podcast when we talk about some of the issues of Trudeau's prime ministership. But TLDR, he was very pro-lockdown.
Yes.
Very pro-mandate.
Really thought the Chinese had just set the model for the rest of the world to follow.
And he thought he did such a great job of managing COVID that he called a snap election in Canada. So because Canada is a Westminster parliamentary system, the ruling party can call an election more or less whenever they want.
Yeah.
They have a mandate of 4 to 5 years, and so they have to call an election every few years, just required under law. But they can call one earlier if they think that they can win one.
Yeah.
And so he called one 2 years after he had previously held one in 2019 because COVID happened, and he thought that he did a good job running the country. So in October of 2021, he called a snap election. And nothing changed, literally. I mean, the Liberals picked up 5 seats. They did not have, a governing majority.
Yeah.
But, for example, the Conservatives didn't change at all. The New Democrats barely changed at all. And so it was
Liberals
basically
picked up 5 seats.
Yeah, it was basically effectively no change from 2 years earlier. And that was the last time Canada held an election. And so what this means is that under law, they must hold an election by October of this year.
Mm-hmm.
They can hold one earlier, but they have to by October. So what has Justin Trudeau done with his 4-year mandate that he apparently clinched? Not really a mandate, because again, remember, he lost the popular vote to the Conservatives, but because the Liberals have such an efficient coalition of where their voters are located, they're all in the urban and suburban areas.
Well, and can we explain something here too? Is that when you look at, so scroll down just a little bit so they can see not the whole way, just all the way up. So I want them to see all the major parties here. So you have New Democratic, Green, Liberal, and Bloc Quebec. Those are all left-leaning political parties. I don't know much about
People's Party is the right-wing populist party. They want to be like the Reform UK version of Canada. But they're pretty irrelevant right now.
Yeah, but all of those other ones, those 4 other parties, are generally left of center or far left political parties. And then obviously Bloc Quebec kind of has its own agenda, where there's been a separatist movement where the French portion, the predominantly French portions of Canada would essentially separate and become its own country, which they have since learned would be devastating for them because they're actually heavily reliant on other portions of Canada to support their welfare state.
So we'll probably get to that at some point in this podcast, because you would be surprised. Quebec separatism is making a comeback, and it's like number 6 or 7.
Yeah.
Historically, Quebec separatism was always the issue, the crisis issue in Canadian politics, in part because if you look at, remember, the teal is the separatists, basically.
Yeah.
Look at this map here. If Quebec broke off, the maritime provinces would be physically separated from the rest of Canada. Canada would face an existential crisis of its own territorial integrity. And so the threat of Quebec separatism has traditionally been like the primary crisis point in Canadian politics.
Yeah.
That's now number like 6 or 7
Yeah.
on the priority list right now, which really goes to show how many issues have popped up. But
Sure.
yeah, you'd think that they would learn that if they broke off, they wouldn't have all the cheap oil and gas that Alberta supplies them, and the money too.
Yeah.
But this is making a comeback. Actually, there is a chance that the separatists will take back control of the Quebec government and then try to force another independence referendum in the next 5 to 10 years. But anyway, that's where they're at, right? So that's the background. So Trudeau's been running the country for 9 years. And so obviously he's done a bang up job because he's, he's a progressive. And,
clearly.
He's doing all the necessary things to drag Canada into a post-national 21st century environment where, we're upholding DEI principles and post-colonialism and indigenous land acknowledgements.
What Canada needed was more woke, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's clearly what was going to make Canada great again. So go ahead and let's get into what exactly he did.
Turns out that his own caucus, threw him out of office. There we go.
Yeah.
So,
the interesting.
This is October is when this news story dropped. By the way, this is 3-4 months ago, and it's been going on for a while that he's been facing calls to resign, and as we know, just a few days ago he did. We'll get to that in a minute, but the wheels have been falling off the bus for a while.
Yeah.
So you were about to say something.
No. I want to get into the specifics because I think this is one of the biggest problems that we have within politics is that a lot of the times the policies which do a lot of damage are not directly connected to the people which implemented those policies. And so you'll either have changeovers in government or whatnot, but there's not always a direct line from the policy to the pain. And it creates this environment where politicians are very, very good at blaming a whole host of other things as opposed to the policy that they actually implemented that caused the pain. And Trudeau didn't get away with this. Trudeau owned a lot of these approaches to government with respect to housing, with respect to immigration, with respect to agriculture, with respect to guns, with respect to taxes. He thought he was at that moment. This is always the trick, right? He was at that moment where he thought people fell in love with liberal policies. No. They fell in love with liberal marketing. And this has always been a problem for the left. The moment they start being very, very honest about what they're doing, combined with the power to effectively implement it, and the results come back, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I didn't want this. You said you were just going to make everything better and wonderful and lovely. What's all this crap? It's like, yeah, that's that. Again, you fell for the marketing. Here's the policy results. So let's go into that.
Yeah. So it all started to unravel. I mean, you could argue that it started to unravel long before this, but the end came in December of last year. Long story short, Trudeau's deputy prime minister and finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, was set to announce the fall economic update. Basically, it's an economic statement. It's kind of like an addendum to the Canadian budget. Well, the day that she was supposed to reveal the updated budgetary figures, she resigned.
Yeah.
And then her
doesn't that usually mean like you got really bad news and you don't want to have to?
Oh, it's
even worse than really bad news.
You just don't typically see that. You don't I mean, it would be the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury. Like imagine Trump's Secretary of the Treasury, the day he or she is supposed to say, okay, here's the status of X, Y, and Z, saying, yeah, I'm done. I'm out.
It's even worse than that because she was the deputy prime minister, which means that if something happened to Trudeau, she would automatically, at least in the interim, become the acting prime minister. So it's almost like fuse the Treasury Secretary with the Speaker of the House with the Vice President.
Yeah.
And have all three of those people resign at once.
Say, we're out.
And say we're out because there was a policy disagreement with the president. That's the best analogy that I can
explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So what happened was the TLDR is that Freeland resigned. And this was such a big story that American politicians picked up on it. And typically they don't pick up on the inner workings of Canadian politics like this. The average American typically can't name who the deputy prime minister of Canada is, right?
Yeah.
Not because
I wouldn't have been able to. I mean,
but this was such a big deal that it caught on even in the U.S., this news story. And part of the reason is because she resigned. her designated replacement immediately resigned on the spot rather than reveal the budgetary figures.
That was the other crazy part. It wasn't just that the primary person resigned. It's that her replacement was like, yeah, I'm not going to do this either. And it just put Trudeau in this horrible situation where now everyone is like, what the hell are you hiding? Like,
and did anybody ever reveal the numbers?
Yeah,
Yes.
so at first, there was nobody in Parliament to reveal these budget figures. And then finally, the government revealed them, and it ended up being a $62 billion deficit, which by American standards,
yeah, it's a rounding error, but like up there. Because remember, Canada has the population of roughly what, Texas?
It's like it's about Texas to California.
Yeah, somewhere between, around there. So the budget is obviously much smaller than the United States. They're still a powerful and wealthy country, but it's much, much smaller. But that was the greatest budget deficit in all of Canadian history. And you have to understand, when she went into this position, one of the primary things, I think she said, like, the number one is we're holding the line on the deficit.
She called it a guardrail.
Yes, a guardrail. They are holding the line that there will be no increase in deficit spending. It exploded. Yeah, as Nick said, it was the worst in Canadian history. And so the story of what happened is that we now know this after the fact. This came out actually very recently. She had a disagreement with Trudeau on how to handle potential issues related to the broader economy at large, but also the incoming tariff threat from Donald Trump. And so this happened after the November election here in the US, because Trump said that he's going to put a 20 to 25% tariff on Canadian products because of a variety of reasons of disputes that he has with the Canadian government. Yeah.
And that would be devastating for the Canadian economy, because it's like 60 to 70% of all Canadian trade is with us.
Yeah.
We are easily their largest trading partner, whereas we are not their, they are not our largest
trading partner. Yeah.
But we are their largest. And so Trudeau wanted to give everybody like a $250 check to deal with a 25% tariff. And Freeland, she has a lot of issues, and we're going to get to some of those. I actually even have some clips. But to her credit, on this one issue, she was right. She called it a gimmick and said, this is not going to fix a total implosion of the Canadian economy if we end up in a trade war with our largest ally and trading partner. We need to find a way to avoid this problem, or work with the Americans, not just hand out $250 checks to everybody and say, good luck losing your job because you're in a trade war with the U.S. And Trudeau wouldn't have anything, he didn't agree. And so he told her, I'm going to remove you as finance minister and put you in a different cabinet position. She disagreed with that, so she just resigned outright, rather than haggle with him on this anymore. And so what that basically announced is that the government blew up in his face, right? I mean, he was having cabinet ministers just resign on the spot in protest to him. And so,
well, and keep in mind too, this has been over a long train of things. Like from COVID, it was everything with taxes associated with green energy. That this is where you had all the farmers,
carbon tax.
Yeah, the carbon tax. You had all the farmers and whatnot coming in, and then all of a sudden he really cracked down. I mean, he was using anti-terror legislation to freeze bank accounts, jail people. It was. I mean, all of a sudden, he just kind of unilaterally took away Canadians' gun rights. Just oh no, you don't get these anymore. We're just freezing handgun purchases in Canada. This also goes to show what happens when you don't have something like a strong Bill of Rights that actually restricts government power.
They could just do what they want willy-nilly.
Oh yeah, the immigration policy created huge issues. The sort of green energy policy and building policies that were both at a federal level and at a local municipal level where the Liberals were in charge made it impossible to build new houses as you are drastically increasing your population through immigration. So all of these things are taking place. It's this perfect storm of a Liberal government getting to do everything they've dreamed of doing. We're going to take your guns. We're going to do more green energy. We're going to raise your taxes. We're going to, open the borders. We're going to put all kinds of restrictions on building housing so it looks just the way we want. All of it. He got all of it. And he got all of it kind of at once. And the Conservatives weren't able to do much about it to stop it because of the governing coalition that Trudeau had among all of the left of center parties. And the end result is when you look at where it was in 2020 with respect to that election cycle and what the polls are suggesting now, people have made the connection They have made the connection between the policies, or at least this is what the polling suggests. They've either made the connection with the policies and the pain, or they've at the very least lost complete faith in Justin Trudeau. And I think a big part of that is members of his own governing coalition standing up and saying, yeah, we've lost faith in Justin Trudeau. Here will be the next question, though. And we'll kind of get into this a little bit with Pierre, and then we're going to get into the whole idea of Trump annexing. But the real question is will they go beyond the person? Because this has always been the problem in politics. It's like, the problem was that guy.
Yeah.
Well, wait a second. That guy had a series of policies. If you don't actually draw the connection beyond the guy to the policies, then you're going to end up with similar policies, but a different guy. And then wondering, well, what? This guy was bad too. Oh, if they keep implementing the same policies, it's not the guy, right? It's the policies. And so it's not going to be good enough to just say, okay, we've elected somebody new. The question is will new policies come in, and will people make the proper associations? So where are we at in the polling right now?
It's great, actually. From our perspective, it's incredible. Here's the chart.
But when they combine with their socialists and all of that, they're still very competitive.
You have to remember they're polling against each other.
Okay.
They're not one party.
Yeah.
And so if you have a race where the conservatives get 50% or 49%, the liberals get 26% and the NDP get 25%, the conservatives win that seat overwhelmingly because the liberals and the NDP are not polling together. They're polling against each other. They're competing against each other for these seats. And so even though they're both left-wing parties, understand
I get what
the
you're
Liberal
saying.
Party of Canada is a liberal party.
Yeah.
It has adopted so many socialist workings, but it is a liberal party, whereas the NDP is a almost explicitly socialist, hyper woke party. In fact, actually, what's interesting is that traditionally their base of support were in heavily unionized areas in the northern part of the state, where you have a lot of like mining, manufacturing, oil, energy related type of stuff. And so the NDP's coalition is split in two ways. One, you have a lot of like blue collar unionized workers in like rural Canada, and then you have a bunch of like woke college, urbanites in Vancouver or something like that, right? Whereas the Liberal Party their coalition is best described as, by American standards, the analogy that I would use is the type of person who voted for Mitt Romney and Kamala Harris.
Got it.
Is like a typical Liberal Party voter. And then the Conservative Party is the Conservative Party.
Well, and can we also draw a distinction here, right? Like one of the reasons, because the Conservative Party imploded in the UK, in part because there was nothing really conservative about it. They had really, really bad leadership within the Conservative Party, where basically they were implementing labor policies at a slower rate than labor would have. But they got blown out because the policy, again, it didn't matter if you put a conservative government in charge of the liberal policies don't work. And what people did is they didn't make an association with the policies. They just looked at the Conservative Party and said, you guys have presided over, horrible things that we don't want. I guess we'll give the Labor a shot. And Labor's like, okay, cool. We're going to take all the bad policies they had and we're going to like put the accelerator on it. This is why the Reform Party in the UK has gained a lot of steam. And the Conservative Party has been in trouble. Now, conservatives in the UK have a new leader, and she's like very dynamic. Like she knows how to fight on the floor, but there's going to be some time for voters in the UK the reason why that's relevant to this is the Conservative Party is now essentially led by, Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre is one of the most articulate fighters on this, and he does an excellent job of combating the press. And so even though you have the New People's Party, which is kind of like it would be the equivalent of like a Reform Party in the UK.
They haven't gained traction yet
because people still believe the Conservative Party stands for something in the UK, and because they're not the ones that have presided over all the problems right now.
Well, they have an excellent spokesperson who articulates everything
and
really well.
And they're not the government. So we 2
that's
years
right.
ago,
They're not responsible for all the crap that's happening because they've been in the minority,
now,
right?
if
what do you think are the chances of Pierre becoming prime minister.
100%.
I don't see any way right now. Like one of the questions was, Darth said, could the left-wing parties not collude to prevent the Conservatives from winning in Canada like what hhappened in France? At this point, I don't think they could.
And in part because there's no runoff system. There's no what do they call it? Ranked choice voting or you know, there's no runoff. There's no ranked choice voting. And keep in mind, liberal voters are not always like socialist voters. There are liberal voters that if the Liberal Party implodes, and so like look at the chart here, you can see that here's the results from 2021. So this is by raw popular votes. You can see that liberals and conservatives were very close to each other, right? Technically, the conservatives won more votes, but they didn't win more seats because the Liberal coalition is very efficiently distributed. And then the socialists, the NDP, are down here. It's almost 18%. And then you got all these minor parties, you know, the Quebec separatists, the People's Party, the Greens, etc. So you see that, like, yeah, Canada is a center-left country because only a third of, you know, of the country voted for the Conservatives. But look at where they are today, and look at the trend line. I mean, and here's the dates here. It was around COVID. It was around the trucker convoy protest that took place in February of 2022. Is when it was in that time frame that the Liberals lost their lead, and then they were trending relatively close until about the summer of 2023, when the Conservatives opened up just an enormous lead that then grew and grew and grew and grew. And now when you look at where things are today, they're at almost 50% of the polling in a multi-party system.
Because all of the left wing, with except of Bloc Quebec, which again is kind of unique in this whole thing because of the whole separatist element, all of the left-wing parties have taken some of a nosedive. The Liberals have, NDP not as much, but it's still on a downward trend. And then Green is also on a downward trend and didn't have much farther down to go. So again, people are across the board associating, you know, with the left-wing coalition, not just a particular figure or a particular element of that left-wing coalition.
What this is disaffected liberal voters switching to the Conservatives. Yeah. Not NDP. NDP voters are never going to vote Conservative, ever. But there are many liberal voters that if things are really bad like they are right now, they will desert their own party.
Well, let me ask a question here, because you said NDP is never going to vote that way. And Hindi in the chat said, NDP is heavy union in British Columbia, Vancouver, with all of the lumber and mining. And the thing I would say there is...
those people might.
One of the things that we've seen within the United States is there was this working class, you know, blue collar union, a lot of times associated with things like manufacturing and things like that within the United States, that always saw the Democrats as being the pro-union party. And what they've now seen is that is not the modern Democratic Party. They hate me, actually. And so, you know, they will still have some left of center ideologies when it comes to economics or, you know, protectionism or things like that. But they certainly don't see Justin Trudeau as the hero of the working man or the, you know, the logger or the miner or things like that. And that's going to be the question. The UK went through this under Margaret Thatcher. And it was incredible because she had to break up some incredibly powerful unions and state-run industries in the UK, and she managed to do it. You don't have quite the same.
That's also, though, why a lot of these former heavily working class areas of England, like Northern England or Southern Wales, will never vote for the Tories ever.
Yes. Yeah.
But what's interesting is they might vote for reform.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions coming in about annexation, and I'm trying to kind of hold off asking.
Hold it off for the third part.
Okay, but let's get to that.
Finished the first
part. Let's get to that fairly quick, though. Well, we got to go through the second two here because everyone's asking questions about annexation. So
by the time Trudeau left, 19% of people in Canada wanted him to stay on as prime minister. So his resignation speech must have been devastating news to the 19% of Canadians that thought, I really liked high grocery prices, record inflation, unaffordable housing. He had a favorability rating of underwater by 43 points.
Wow.
That's way worse than Joe Biden.
Yeah.
By the way, the same day that Chrystia Freeland dropped out, there was a special election for a Canadian riding that the Conservatives won in an overwhelming landslide. You're talking like a 30-point shift to the right from 2021. And so finally, this led to this moment, one of the greatest moments in Canadian political history. We'll play just a few seconds of it.
Yeah.
I intend to resign
Yay!
as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process.
All right. Bye, Justin. Thanks. That's all we were looking for.
So yeah, that was, he held on until the very end, until it was clear that like he was just going to be thrown out by his own party, basically.
Yeah.
And now it's too late for the Liberal. I mean, they can hold off until October. Whoever replaces him, I think there's a good chance it'll be Chrystia Freeland that replaces him, but it's too late for the party. They've run the country into the ground. They're going to get wiped out. So who is going to replace him? Well, temporarily, it might be Freeland, but by October at the latest, and it could be much earlier than October if they hold an election in probably like April or May, depending on whether or not a vote of no confidence brings down the government. Who is almost certainly going to replace him, as we hinted at earlier in the show, is Pierre Poilievre, who is the leader of the Conservative Party. And I've got a few clips of him articulating some of the problems that have led to this point. How did Trudeau drop out? He was boy wonder. I remember that this guy was being shilled in American media 9 years ago with people like John Oliver saying that you need to vote for Justin Trudeau to my Canadian audience. So how did this guy that was a darling of the woke left get thrown out? Well,
Canada's Gavin Newsom.
Pierre explains in several clips, and we've got some other charts and figures that illustrate the scale of the problem in Canada. So here's one about the housing crisis that Canada is experiencing right now.
Well, I would take responsibility for the fact that you could buy the average house in Canada for $450,000 when our government was in power. I will take full responsibility for that. And right now, that price is $720,000. So it is 58% higher today than it was when Conservatives were in office. But the member is quite right that in his province, the problem is the worst. Where we have an NDP mayor in Vancouver, you can't get anything built. And so it's great for the rich. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad for everybody. If you've got a mansion in Vancouver, you're getting richer every day. You don't have to do a lick of work. You sit back on your big fat assets and get richer every day. And you've got an NDP premier who...
You'll find I've got a few more clips of him.
Let's do a few more.
You'll find out he's a good dynamic public speaker.
He is. I love some of his interactions with the press as well. But go ahead, let's show the next one.
Okay, so to illustrate Pierre's point, I've got a few graphs that I want to briefly go through. Here's population growth compared to housing construction. For our audio listeners, this chart is devastating to the Canadian economy. They are not building enough homes to keep up with population growth. And if you look, it was relatively stable until about, 2015.
When Justin Trudeau.
That's when Justin Trudeau took over. And now look at what's happened over the last just few years. Canada is bringing in over 1 million. Canada's growing by over 1 million people a year.
Well, and real quick, and
housing's gone nowhere.
Our videos are kind of like in the way of the last part of the graph here. But if you look at the last part of the graph, you see essentially a doubling of population growth within Canada. That's not because it's cold and Canadians cozied up, especially close that year. That's because of mass immigration.
Oh, man, you spoiled it. We were right about to get to it.
Well, this is the way it looks right there. Is there a way to slide it?
Yeah.
They can't even see it.
No, they can't. I wonder if there's a way for Nate to just move me off this. Here. This will illustrate the problem. No, unfortunately I can't, but this will illustrate the problem. Here's housing prices compared to the other G7 countries. So this is France, the United States, Italy, Germany, Britain, Japan. Canada is off the charts. It's the most unaffordable housing market of any G7 country in the entire world. So these are like the largest economies in the world. The average person cannot even remotely hope to afford a home in Canada. It's, again, look at the change, right? And in 2000, the average is 0, and so now it's over 300. So that's a 3x increase in 25 years. 3x increase. Have incomes gone up 3x? No, they haven't.
And again, it's important for people to understand that it's not just the immigration, right? It's the immigration combined with the other regulatory policies, tax policies, and everything else that have created conditions where they desperately need more housing, and they're not allowed to build it because it's so expensive to build. And then that has an impact throughout the rest of the economy as well, because housing is not just any old factor within the economy. It's significant. The other one that you see.
Hey, this is the same chart. I can zoom out now.
Okay, here we go.
Nick or Nate, let me know if I need to zoom out a little bit more.
Put
in more. Okay.
no, yeah, put it right there.
Zoom
okay.
out more.
Okay, zoom out more.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the same thing. This is housing construction, housing completions compared to change in population going all the way back to the 80s. This is the same chart, different format. You can see, so this is COVID, this huge dip, and I'm going to try to explain this for our audio listeners. There's a huge dip after 2019, which is COVID, where population growth went basically nowhere. That's because Canada wasn't bringing people in through immigration. What happened after COVID, 2022, 23, 24? Oh, it goes over 1.2 million a year.
Yeah.
Remember, this is a country with a population that is about the size of California, growing by 1.2 million people in a year. So this is obviously Canada has a baby boom, right?
Yeah. No.
No, this is mass migration.
Canada, I believe, has a birth rate below replacement.
Yeah, it's mass migration. It's replacement level migration that's taking place. And
yeah, so everyone knows, because we keep making comparisons. Canada has 40.1 million people. California has 38.9. So Canada has slightly more people than California. And again, it's not because of rising birth rates within Canada. It's because of mass immigration.
And so obviously they're bringing in hardworking people that want to assimilate into Canadian culture, adopt Canadian identity, and are gonna contribute to the furtherance of Canada's long
the greatness of Canada
heritage and traditions, right? No, actually, instead, it turns out that they're getting sectarian violence between competing ethnic and religious groups from India.
Yeah.
So again, Wikipedia is a sham, and I say this as somebody who has over 20,000 edits on Wikipedia. Because I was a weirdo in high school.
Yeah.
But
oh, don't sell yourself short. You're still a weirdo.
I'm still a weirdo today.
Listen,
But,
Connor's asking for the links to this to be posted in Circle because it's pretty interesting stuff.
Okay. I'll definitely share some of this stuff after the podcast. But even though Wikipedia is a joke, I have this article up because I just want to briefly walk the audience through what's happened. So there's an ongoing diplomatic dispute between Canada and India. And that diplomatic dispute, it's not about trade. It's not about, market share in certain products, maybe, right? It's about political assassinations that have taken place on Canadian soil of individuals like Sikh nationalists over again, sectarian, ethnic, and religious dispute in India. And for those of you who might have a globe or a map in front of them, India is not a neighbor of Canada.
No, it turns out.
It turns out it's actually on the other side of the world,
quite literally,
from Canada. And Canada is now dealing with political violence in their own country because it's being bled over from political violence in India. That's how bad the immigration process, the immigration crisis is in this country right now. The mass migration has taken place to a point that you now have sectarian violence in Canada over ethno-religious disputes in a country on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
That's insane if you think about it. Imagine the U.S. having ethnic violence breaking out between Ukrainian and Russian individuals moving to the U.S.
Yeah.
Imagine Ukraine, so many Ukrainians and so many Russians coming over into the U.S. that they're shooting each other in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Reason I say Chicago is because, long time passion of Chicagoites. But like that is the analogy that I can come up with. Like the immigration system in Canada is so broken, there is no assimilation. Instead, you just have ethnic enclaves that are popping up within Canadian cities, and individuals are literally murdering prominent, political exiled activists that are carrying their identity politics from foreign countries into Canada and not assimilating because they're continuing this. I mean, if you think about it,
let's also acknowledge something. Part of the reason why assimilation doesn't take place through immigration in a way that it used to, and look, I don't have rose-colored glasses. Like, I know that when there's a reason why in the United States you had Chinatown and Little Italy, and you had Irish enclaves, and you had all of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it wasn't strange or unusual for people coming to a new land to find other people with shared culture and heritage in order to kind of get started. But what eventually happened over time is that kind of the underlying cultural components of the United States still dominated. There was no, I don't believe there was any concerted effort by any ethnic group within the United States to essentially overthrow the American system. They wanted to be a part of it. They wanted to take elements of their culture and heritage with them. Who wouldn't? But there was still a dominant American culture that they wanted to be a part of and could be a part of.
Yes.
Canada used to feature something very, very similar. The difference is, and this is the other part that you talk about, it's not just the immigration. It's not just the way the immigration policy is taking place. It's not just that combined with the taxes or the regulations or the inability to build housing. It's also combined with a woke ideology that tells the people coming into your country, you're better than us. We're bad. We're horrible. We're mean. We're racist. We're so glad you're coming here to save us.
We need you to enrich us.
For the horrible society and complete lack of culture that we possessed before you got here. You're encouraging people to not assimilate. In fact, you're not even encouraging people to remain atomized within their own, cultures. You're encouraging them to take over yours. And that's what wokeism has done. That is what leftism has done in Canada and has been attempting to do within the United States. Come here not to be a part of us. Come here to fix us because we're obviously mean and bad and horrible. And oh, by the way, when you get here, could you please vote for us? Because we'd like more control over the power.
And by us,
economy.
you mean the liberals or the Democrats?
Yeah, the leftists is the best way to put it. But
That is a perfect explanation of the problem on a cultural perspective. The year that Trudeau became prime minister in 2015, he infamously said Canada is a post-national state.
Yeah.
It has no identity. He literally verbatim said, we have no Canadian identity. It's simply values. It's tolerance and compassion and empathy and kindness. That's what it means to be a Canadian. There's no identity.
Being super nice. That's supposed to be, it's saying I'm sorry over everything is kind of baked into Canadian culture. I said I was sorry to somebody one time and they asked if I was Canadian because they're Canadian and I had bumped them and they're like, oh, you must be Canadian because you said you were sorry. I'm like, no, I bumped you. So I said I was sorry. I'm an American. But they assumed since I said I was sorry that I was a Canadian, which is crazy because I did not say I was sorry.
The last point that I want to say on immigration before we move to some of these other clips of Pierre, I've got to show you some of these clips.
Yeah.
You're gonna be blown away. Is that if you think about in the U.S. when we had large immigration from Europe about 100 years ago, like Germans and Italians and Scandinavians that were coming over, and Poles and Eastern Europeans, imagine the Italian immigrants into the U.S. in 1890s or early 1900s engaging in political violence over the territorial dispute between Italy and Austria-Hungary for Trieste and South Tyrol.
Yeah.
Like that is the that is the point that Canada's gotten to, where again there's sectarian violence over ethno-religious disputes in countries halfway around the world. When that happens, you realize that the immigration process is broken. And that there's a real problem. But it's not just housing. It's not just immigration. The entire economy is imploding in Canada right now. And I have some clips from Pierre speaking where he's warning, in some cases, years ahead of the fact of almost every single one of the problems that have now popped up.
Let's take a look at some of those.
Okay. So here's one. And this is great. You're going to love this, Nick.
And perhaps the most creative of all of the modern monetary theorists was the Emperor Dionysius from 2,500 years ago. He thought it was a modern idea then, too. He was the dictator of the city-state of Syracuse. And of course, because of all of his sumptuous living and his ridiculous war fighting, he needed cash. So he took the drachmas from his people. And every 1 drachma, he stamped with a 2. And all of a sudden, he had twice as much money.
The honourable member for Kingston
Keep
and
listening.
the Islands.
I just want to know, Madam Speaker, if there's going to be a test on this history lesson afterwards, and if I should be expecting that to come when the member's done.
Hardly a point. Forwarded the honourable member for Carleton.
Well, the test has been running for 4 years now, and they've been getting an F year after year after year. So, yes, indeed.
Pause it right there. So is this moment that he went into his explanation, I'm like, well, this obviously explains why Christian loves this guy. But as soon as that guy got up there and said, oh, will there be a test? I was like, oh, he's about to get crushed. Because I've seen Pierre speak enough to where you will see somebody on the left or somebody in the press think that they are laying a trap for Pierre, and he will crush them every single time. But like, imagine too the arrogance of that. Like, oh, will there be a test at the end of this? It's like you are implementing a policy that has been implemented like hundreds of times in the past, always to the same detrimental outcome for the people you claim to care about, and you refuse to learn from it. And instead you want to do this little cocky, like, what a nerd. He knows stuff about Syracuse. No, dumbass. He understands that the policy that you're implementing is hurting people. And maybe if you cared a little bit more about understanding how economics works, how reality works, how incentive structures work, than you do about making cute little quips like you just did, your people would be better off. Do you care about that? But it's so wonderful to watch again.
I've got
Pierre
more.
Just on the fly crush somebody like that.
Trust me, I've got more. And these are all, by the way, for the audience, these are all. I watch Pierre's stuff on economics like for fun.
Yeah, I do too.
So I've seen all this stuff before because he's making this speech 3 years ago. This is the height of the COVID money spending. This is before. This is important for the audience. This is before the inflation. This is before the economic crisis that Canada is currently in. This is Pierre warning that the $600 billion that the Bank of Canada printed and injected into the economy was going to create an inflationary crisis unlike anything the country has ever seen before. And he was totally vindicated. I've got some more of this stuff that I want to play for you, though, Nick.
Now, we're told that inflation will never happen here. All these things about printing money causing inflation, that's all thinking. Remember, history doesn't repeat itself, Madam Speaker, except that it's already repeating itself. Let's start with housing prices. From December 2019, the last month before COVID started to circulate in Canada, to March 2021, the average house went from $518,000 to $716,000. A massive 38% increase in a time when the economy dropped by $120 billion. So the economy goes down, but somehow housing prices go up.
I've got more. Here's another one.
But here's the consequence of all of these numbers. When governments print money, they drive up the price of two things. One, the things that the rich own. And two, the things that everyone else buys. So if you are a millionaire mansion owner, you're getting extremely rich. Your house is making a lot more money than you are. You're sitting in your rocking chair and cash is just falling out of your attic on your head. But if you are a working class person who rents in order to have a roof overhead, your rent is going up, your food is going up, your gas is going up, everything you buy is going up, except your wages are not. And guess what? That dream of owning a house, it's getting further and further away.
Pause that real quick. That was one of the best explanations I've ever, when he said, when you're driving up the inflation, you're doing two things. You're increasing the cost of the things the rich own and what everybody else buys. And this is the dangerous part. This is where the socialists usually come in and say, yes, see, it's the rich, it's the greedy rich that are causing these sort of economic downturns for working people. When in reality, it's like, no, it's you. You created the economic conditions that allowed for, again, the wealthy to get more wealthy, not as a result of increased productivity, but because they own assets that benefit from inflationary monetary policy. And now you're offering yourself as the solution for this. And what's your solution? More government control over the economy. That's like taking what you're already doing and adding crack So it's like, no, you will make it even worse, but it's a useful selling point. I see it all the time. The left will implement policies that create this sort of, income disparity that they talk about, and then offer the same policies, but, even worse as the solution to it. And the fact that Pierre is the one getting up there saying, here's what you're actually doing and here's why it's happening the way it is, and putting it in very, very clear language, but also with the depth of understanding, the historical knowledge, the technical knowledge required to be able to hold his ground. Because you will see some people in the conservative movement, and they'll do one of the two. They'll either be so hyper technical that nobody knows what they're talking about and it all sounds academic or esoteric, or it'll be purely populist, but the moment they're asked any sort of, in-depth question, they can't answer it. When you have someone that can do both of those things very, very effectively and actually believes in it, is not just using it to get votes, that is where you get this perfect merging of what you really require to, again, associate in people's minds the policy with the outcome, not just the person implementing the policy.
Yes.
But since we're on this person at the moment, there is a question relevant to it. What is Pierre's view on things other than the economy, such as owning firearms or government involvement in education? So on basically, is he all economics, or are there other things we would agree with him on?
So we were actually having a really interesting discussion. So, all right, for those of you who don't know, we have a Minecraft server.
Yeah.
And that Minecraft server is
what
actually...
a dork.
Yeah, I know, right? I'm a nerd. That Minecraft server is actually run by Connor in our community, and he's done an excellent job with it. And it's actually been kind of a fun way for us to... We'll get on Discord, and we'll talk about policy. We'll talk about philosophy. We'll talk about all of these things. And we had a gentleman the other night in there, and he was talking about one of his concerns is that the conservative movement within Canada does seem to be hyper-focused on the economic component while ignoring a lot of the other social components. So I would say this. My understanding of Pierre's position has been that he seems to be conservative in more areas than just economics, but that doesn't mean his overall party is. That doesn't mean the overall culture is within Canada. And certainly I would defer to the people that actually live in Canada.
Connor says that he's from Alberta, which is the Texas of Canada.
Yeah.
So he's
Pro-gun and
pro-school choice.
Which means homeschooling. So that's significant. Again, that doesn't mean that the rest of the Conservative Party necessarily. I can tell you from personal experience, I serve with Republicans who are not pro homeschooling, not pro school choice, they don't want to confiscate your guns, but they're certainly not interested in expanding any of your gun rights. And so, again, I can't speak to that, but Connor and some of our other members of the audience, they probably could speak to that part a little bit better. But we need to wrap this up so we can get into this third component.
I've got one more clip
Okay.
that has to be played. First off, two very quick charts that I want to show, just back to back. Here's real GDP per capita comparing the U.S. and Canada over time. You can see, and I'll explain for the audio, audio listeners, they were in tandem from 1995 until, look at that, 2015.
I don't
What could have
understand.
happened in 2015?
What
then?
happened in 2015?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Justin Trudeau took office on November 4th, 2015.
Fidel's kid took over Canada.
And if you look in a little bit more detail here, here's an updated chart going all the way to December of 2014.
Well,
So here's COVID.
The
That's
GDP,
because
that's
he
COVID.
cut everything. Yeah, but they didn't need to do that. Like, here's the thing is, everyone kind of goes, oh, well, that was just COVID. But here's the thing is, that did not need to happen.
The sad part is that Canada is poorer today than it was 6 years ago.
Wow.
Here's where it was right before COVID. And here's where it is today.
Yeah.
It is about 1 or 2% lower than it was in November or December of 2019.
And can we also mention something that COVID did? So if you look at when Trudeau takes office in 15, right, you have a bit of a dip.
He took office at the end of 2015.
And then you have this kind of gradual increase in GDP per capita in Canada. But what's fascinating is, okay, you see the dip in COVID. So let's just, for argument's sake, let's just concede that every GDP per capita across the world dipped during COVID for both manufactured reasons and for obvious reasons. What's important to understand about this is that COVID permitted the governments across the world, especially left-wing governments, to exercise power and authority over people's personal lives, their education, their healthcare, and the economy in general in a way they have never been permitted to do, but have always desired. Yeah. And the end result is that they're actually poorer than before when COVID hit, because that's what happens as a result of these policies.
I mean, look at where Canada was in 2017 or 2018. So you're talking about 6 years of zero economic growth. And it's actually falling
downward,
now. GDP per capita is falling in part because they're importing so many people. Remember, per capita.
Yeah.
So if you're importing 1.2 million people a year and the economy is not growing to accommodate all those people, yeah, and raw numbers, GDP might go up because you're importing millions of people. But again, if they're not as productive as everybody else in the country, let alone if they're taking any sort of government services, no, real GDP is going to drop, especially at the same time that Canada's still dealing with the aftermath of massive MMT-style money printing and inflationary budget deficits. And the reason I say inflationary budget deficits is because the last clip that I want to play of Pierre, this is the most shocking clip you will probably ever witness in the entire history of the Canadian Parliament. This is him grilling Chrystia Freeland, who, remember, was the finance minister.
Yeah.
Wait until you see the back and forth exchange. I'm going to pause and skip repeatedly just to illustrate.
All right, you're
it.
setting us up. All right, go ahead. This will be the last clip before we go into this next part.
What percentage of the government's debt is now owned by the Bank of Canada? What percentage?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite knows, our government is operating very much within the fiscal...
The Honourable Member.
The question is, what percentage of our debt is owed to the Bank of Canada?
The Honourable Minister.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, Canada has the fiscal firepower to do what it needs to do. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio.
The Honourable Member.
Is there any limit to the amount the Bank of Canada can print to borrow to the government?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the member opposite should be very careful not to ask the finance minister questions better addressed to the Bank of Canada. I am aware of the independent...
The Honourable Member.
Who holds the shares of the Bank of Canada?
The Honourable Minister.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, I'm the finance minister.
The Honourable Member.
She holds the shares of the Bank of Canada. She's the shareholder. She holds them all. So she's the only one we can ask here in the House of Commons. How much can the Bank of Canada print to fund borrowing to the government?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be very serious for a moment. The independence of the Bank of Canada is one of the central pillars of the Canadian economy. And I'm not going to be frivolous about that.
This year to fund borrowing to the government.
Member. The Honourable Member.
How much has the bank printed this year to fund borrowing to the government?
The Honourable Minister.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, I really want to make clear tonight.
Can we pause for a second? I keep expecting it to be like, I grew up in a middle class.
I'm going to skip just a few more times.
No, this is great. This is great.
Dependent on the printing presses over at the Bank of Canada. Question, how much has the government of Canada borrowed from the Bank of Canada this year?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it represents a profound misunderstanding of how the Canadian economy or any other economy works to suggest that there is some kind of questionable relationship between our government and the Bank of Canada.
The Honourable...
It is just, you know what that was the equivalent of? Everybody's doing it. That was the equivalent of that. Like to question the questionable relationship between a kind of independent bank that we own and control and the ability to just randomly print money so that we can spend it.
The leader of the opposition, actually at the time he wasn't even the leader of the opposition, but Pierre Poilievre is asking questions about how much money the central bank is printing and then giving the government to spend. What an irresponsible question. Ridiculous question. Hang on, it gets better, guys.
Member.
Well, if it wasn't questionable, she'd be willing to talk about it out in the open. I asked how much has the Bank of Canada printed to pay for the government's debts. It's just a mathematical question that should be publicly available Why is the minister hiding it?
Honourable Minister.
I'm not hiding anything, Mr. Speaker. What I am doing is two things. One, being very clear, and this is important for markets.
The honourable member.
But she won't tell the people of Canada how much of their money is being debased to fund her government spending. So I will ask one last time, and then we will know if she won't answer that she's covering it up. How much of the debt of the Government of Canada has been financed by printing by the Bank of Canada this year?
The honourable minister.
It is profoundly irresponsible of the member opposite to suggest that a finance minister defending the independence of the Bank of Canada is, quote unquote, covering up. That's not.
The minister has given a single number with regards to any of these questions. I don't know why that is. If it's because she believes that Canadians don't have the right to know, then she should just say so. She won't tell us the limits on the debt. She won't tell us how much the Bank of Canada has printed to fund her government's debt. She won't tell us whether the debt will be paid back before interest rates rise. Is there anything mathematical or numerical about our debt that anyone on the government side can share with the Canadian taxpayers who will have to repay that debt?
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, let me say a couple of numerical and mathematical things to the member opposite. The first is that the debt service charges as a share of GDP that Canada is paying today is the lowest in 100 years.
That's not the case anymore.
Nope.
And he predicted it. So this is a 6.5. I only played like clips of it, but this is a 6.5 minute long exchange where he's just asking really
basic questions.
Basic questions.
Stuff you should be able to Google.
Yeah.
Right? But no,
it's profoundly irresponsible.
I can't believe it's I'm shocked to find out there's gambling going on here.
Well,
No, but
it's profoundly irresponsible to question, to ask any direct question. Apparently,
well, the other thing too that's interesting about how they use the language here is that GDP numbers are heavily manipulated by government spending and government printing, and. So even the way that she's trying to defend the position doesn't make a great deal of sense, and is obviously obfuscation. There's a very direct answer to Pierre's question here. She just doesn't want to give it,
right?
Because she knows it would be catastrophic. And what ended up happening was that was the same person that was going to be responsible for coming back. So imagine this exchange with Pierre where he basically called it. You're going to do this. You're going to do this. It's going to equal this. It's going to equal this. How do I know this? Because it's going on for thousands of years, and this is always the result. They made fun of him. They mocked him. They told him he was being irresponsible. How dare you, sir? I am so offended that you would suggest I'm covering something up. And then when it came time for her to have to step on that floor and explain exactly what they had done, she knew what it was going to be. It was going to be Pierre Poilievre sitting there the whole night. And what about this? And gosh, I'm confused because I remember saying this and you said checks notes this. And what I was right. Like she knew what it was going to be. She knew what it was going to be. There was going to be no way for her to hide from the fact that this was all accurately predicted. They told him, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. It's going to equal this.
Oh, there's more clips that I didn't play of Pierre making those type of predictions explicitly in 2021, in 2022, and then in 2023 calling out, I said this was going to happen, and lo and behold, it is happening. He even articulated one clip that I did not bring up in today's podcast was him laying out like a 4 to 5 step process of how this was going to unfold, where the government's going to declare this as a crisis. They're going to print the money. They're going to inject it into the economy. Prices are then going to rise, and then they're going to respond with blaming the marketplace, blaming the people, and saying, we haven't done enough to take more money from you or cap prices or, hand out subsidies in order to address the problem. And then it's going to create an even bigger problem because the proposed solution to a crisis you created is going to turn this into an existential crisis that's going to just cripple the entire economy. And that's where Canada now is.
Happened. Well, and I want to move on to the final segment here where we're talking about this whole idea of if you would have told me, right, just a year ago that Canada becoming part of the United States was going to be on the bingo card. Dude, we really got to get to this segment.
Can I read something shocking that I found to you
All right.
first?
Yeah, go ahead.
We were hinting at wokeism, right?
Yeah.
So Canada is notoriously one of the most woke countries in the world. They don't call it LGBTQ. They call it LGBTQIA2L or 2SL plus.
Yeah.
Don't ask me. Is there going to be a quiz on this? Right? Because we know that they have speech laws. This is what Jordan Peterson became famous for, right? They have hate speech laws. We know that they had a tyrannical crackdown of the Freedom Convoy in 2022. They used land acknowledgements and everything in Canada because they don't have the history where they can use wokeism the way that we do, right? They don't have more racism or colonialism, and so they use land acknowledgements. This is something that is used for teachers in Canada when they're trying to get their credentials at their universities. They're taught. This is a paper. I'm going to read a couple sentences that's found in this paper that I discovered, and this goes back to a conversation that we were having on Discord with some of our Canadian members of our community. Quote: I'm directly quoting from this paper. Quote: "The liberal position acknowledges diversity, but has a low level of tolerance of non-Christian faiths. It specifically focuses on the neutrality of secularism, a separation of church and state. In reality, such separation does not exist in Canada, as we see the residual influence of Christianity in the national anthem, statutory holidays, currency, architecture, textbooks, and so on. Neutrality and secularity have been used to maintain Protestant and Roman Catholic hegemony in Canada and to deny minority group rights. Exemption rights are, quote, individually exercised negative liberties granted to a members of a religious or cultural group whose practices are such that a generally and ostensibly neutral law would be a distinctive burden on them. Public education in Canada follows a fundamentalist Christian curriculum with its calendar specifically fitted to the needs of Christians." That's this paper that is arguing that neutrality, stated neutrality, Canada is a very secular state. Yes. Canada tries to stress that it is very secular and very neutral on the question of things like culture and religion. This paper argues neutrality is actually a form of Christian hegemony.
Yeah. Wow.
And then there's other aspects that's like, oh yeah, this also perpetuates whiteness and other stuff. You know what's interesting? This is straight out of Antonio Gramsci. Mm. If you think about it, it is straight out of his prison notebooks where he says culture is not neutral. Culture enforces a particular worldview. Yeah. And a cultural hegemony will defend and reinforce that worldview. And so neutrality is a myth because neutrality gets to be defined by the existing hegemony. Yeah. And they get to present that as neutral. And so this is Gramsci's thought process applied to a weaponized form of wokeism where it's not even just enough for them to say, we're going to push our worldview. They're going after, it's not even good enough to say that you're neutral. Because neutrality is run by all the cis heteronormative white Christians.
And this just begs the question, right? Like, okay, so if you're now admitting that there's no such thing as neutrality, then what are you offering? And what they're offering is not, well, I guess we should respect the culture of the society that we live in. It's like, no, we need to tear it down and replace it with what we would like to have, which again goes in with leftist ideology of neo-Marxism, postmodernism, critical theory, deconstructionism, right? It is their religion. It is their state religion, and that's the one they want. And that one is, by definition, opposed not just to Christianity, but Christianity is its primary target, especially in the West and for obvious reasons.
I had to bring that up before we get to the spicy question at the end because that was shocking to me when I found that type of stuff.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, so this kind of leads us to our final question. And right before I get to that, I want to tell everybody that if you would like to be more actively involved within our community, help us select what the topics are, ask the questions, have your questions prioritized during the show, then we would encourage you to join our IC, the Intentional Community. This is where you not only get to be a part of our live audience and have those questions prioritized, you also have other options because we have monthly meetups with myself and Tina, not to mention more programming that we're actually looking at doing in the future. It's one of the greatest ways that you can use to sponsor our show. We love our advertisers and we're appreciative of the different platforms that we get to host on. However, should any of that go away or all of it go away, we still want to be able to deliver the sort of products and services that we do to our audience. And the IC is a great way for you to be able to do that, contribute to that, and be a member of that. So check out the link in the show notes and consider becoming a member. All right, let's go on to the final question that we have here. And that is, can, should, or will the United States annex Canada. So again, if you go back to a year ago for me, this was nowhere near my bingo card. I never thought this was something that we were actually thinking. The last time there was any real serious talk about the United States taking Canada was the War of 1812.
Which didn't turn out great for us.
Didn't turn out well. We also had the Fenian Rebellion. There was actually a bunch of drunk Irishmen in New England one night got together and said, you know, it would be cool. Actually, they decided that it would be a good idea to go and try to invade Canada. That did not work out well. I had no idea that was actually a chapter in our history until I went to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and I'm looking at this, the Fenian invasion, and it was a bunch of American Irishmen that said, hey, Canada's ours now.
There was also War Plan Red that was drafted in the early 20th century by our military. Militaries have contingency plans, and we had a contingency plan for the event of a potential war with the British Empire that would have entailed an invasion of Canada. But obviously, it never took place because we were.
But that's not how we're considering getting Canada.
No,
right?
ask Trump though how we're considering getting it.
So let's go ahead and listen to Donald Trump talking about this idea of Canada becoming part of the United States.
We don't need anything. So why are we losing $200 billion a year and more to protect Canada? And I said that to, as I called him, Governor Trudeau. I said, listen, what would happen if we didn't subsidize you, if we didn't, because we give them a lot of money. We help them. As an example, we're buying icebreakers, and Canada wants to join us in the buying of icebreakers. I said, we don't really want to have a partner in the buying of icebreakers. We don't need a partner. But no right. Nope, no right. Here's what we have. We have a right not to help them with their financial difficulties because we owe $36 trillion too. We're going to start knocking it out pretty fast, but we're going to be able to do it because of energy and other things. But no right. No right. But why are we supporting a country, $200 billion plus a year? Our military is at their disposal. All of these other things, they should be a state. That's why I told Trudeau when he came down, I said, what would happen if we didn't do it? He said Canada would dissolve. Canada wouldn't be able to function if we didn't take their 20% of our car market. They send us hundreds of thousands.
Hang on, I've got one more. This is now him speaking directly to, it's only 35 seconds, speaking directly to Pierre Poilievre in the same press conference.
Assumption that you're serious about making Canada 51st state of the United States. The leader of the Conservative Party in Canada said, under no circumstance will it ever be the 51st state.
Maybe he won't win, but maybe he will. I don't care.
You had suggested.
Listen, I don't care what he says.
But Sir Rofes, you said you were considering military force to acquire Panama and Greenland. Are you also considering military force to annex and acquire Canada?
No, economic force, because Canada and the United States. That would really be something.
Okay, so here's
economic force, apparently.
Yeah. No, so the first thing to point out here, and this is important, is it is not as if Trump is saying that America has any sort of like inherent right or manifest destiny or anything like that to take Canada. He's essentially making an argument that Canada's economy and really Canada's security is so inextricably tied to U.S. economic and military power that it actually would make more economic sense in the larger scheme of things to actually unite than to remain two separate entities. and that's an interesting argument to make. And it's one that ultimately let's look at a couple different scenarios. He's already ruled out the military scenario, which I'm glad of, right? Like I don't believe in the
no war plan red.
I don't believe that simply because you have the military power to do something that you should, invade and take over another country. I'm not that guy. I'm not a conquest ethic guy. But militarily, I mean, the Canadian military, which by the way, I've worked with the Canadian military. If you look at my uniform, I have Canadian jump wings because I jumped with the Canadians. I actually have a lot of respect for a lot of elements within the Canadian military, their capability. They actually have a really, really interesting, the military history of Canada is interesting. In fact, if you look at a lot of the specific things that we now rule out as war crimes, there may be a Canadian division associated with some of those.
The Canadians exclusively stormed one of the beaches at Normandy.
They did. So the Canadian military, again, I have a lot of proud history, a lot of respect for it. it simply does not have the war fighting capacity of the United States. The Canadian military would not be able to sustain a military engagement, any sort of like conventional military engagement with the United States beyond 30 days. Like that's just the reality of it. So there's always that. And I don't bring that up because I want it to happen or think it should happen or think it would be moral. I bring it up because in matters of realpolitik, that always matters. That always matters. The difference is that for about, I don't know, 50 years, in the West, we've pretended like it doesn't. We pretended that overwhelming economic and military power doesn't ultimately, of course we're not going to. And this is where, and for the first time probably in my lifetime, we've had a president that is talking about using the U.S. military. And again, when we talk about things like Greenland, when we talk about things like the Panama Canal, when we talk about what he just said would happen if the hostages were not released before he took office, we're talking about someone that understands the absolute dominance of U.S. military power and is not afraid and is willing to leave it on the table. Now, again, I don't think Donald Trump was again, the first president of my lifetime that wasn't going around getting us involved in new wars. But by the same token, he was not afraid to use U.S. military power when he thought it was in our interests. And so there's this dynamic there with when he talks about not just Canada, but other places where when he says the Panama Canal is absolutely critical to U.S. economic and security, national security. He means it. And I do believe he would use the U.S. military if he thought that there was a legitimate reason to go down there and take it. So there's always that, right? There's always the idea. And I don't think people properly understand. A lot of people get involved in what I call Excel spreadsheet warfare, where they take an Excel spreadsheet and they look at the total number of tanks on one side and the total number of tanks on the other side and say, oh, well, look, they've got more tanks than us. No, a T-72 and an M1 Abrams are not, they might as well be a horse cavalry against an actual tank. That the difference in combat power between those two things is so significant as to be meaningless for the other side.
It's worth noting, though, that
it's the same thing with air power. It's the same thing with a lot of it. There's a reason why China is not trying to beat us when it comes to carrier battle groups. China is not trying to beat us when it comes to the best fighter or bomber aircraft. China is investing a lot on how to infiltrate our telecom system, which they've done incredibly effectively, right, in order to engage in asymmetric warfare against the United States. So all that to say.
But Trump has ruled out, I mean, yes, Trump is bringing up stuff that would have been historically unprecedented, but he has said, like, we're not going to invade Canada.
No.
He's making the argument that economically it would make far more sense from his perspective if the U.S. and Canada united, because there's, from his standpoint, an artificial border. You could argue all borders are artificial, but again, I'm just saying from his perspective, he thinks that there's a border that results in things like tariffs, trade restrictions, and the fact that Canada is a much smaller, almost 10 times smaller country than the U.S., not quite 10 times.
Yeah.
But the U.S., through its military force, subsidizes Canada, especially nowadays, because the Canadian military historically was quite strong, punched above its weight, but Trudeau has kind of gutted at it. And Trump's whole point is that, like, why don't we become one country? Because we're already your largest trading partner. You're getting rich off of us. And defending Canadian jobs, why don't we just make them all American jobs? Why don't we make it all one unified military force, one unified airspace?
The problem is, and just going back to something you said in an earlier podcast, is that, our culture, our country is not just economics, and it's not just, there is a cultural identity, and there may be a ton of Canadians who are on the apology tour to everyone else, and trying to erase their culture. But there are also Canadians who very strongly want to remain Canadians, Pierre being one of them.
Sure. No, I understand. There is a
So if somebody came to our country, even if Biden, like, was driving us into the ground still, and we didn't have the prospect of Trump steering us out of this mess, even under those circumstances, if another country came in and was like, you guys are going bankrupt, without us, you would die, you should just be one of us. There would be something in us that was like, no, I'm an American. And I think there is a lot of people in Canada who are like, no, I'm a Canadian. I'm proud of being a Canadian, and I just want to get back to what's right here.
I think that's true. I also think that, again, so let's say military doesn't happen, but it's the economic argument that Christian just articulated, and the idea that it could potentially, especially for places like Alberta, there's no question that Alberta would be significantly better off as a part of the United States, even as a territory of the United States, than it probably is as a province within Canada, because Alberta makes a ton of money and then has it taken from it and distributed to other parts of Canada that then vote directly against Alberta's interests, right? So that's a real issue for places like Alberta. You could argue Saskatchewan too, and some other provinces, right? But to Tina's point, there's the patriotic component, right? Again, I'm an American.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to, but I will say this. The interesting component is that the Canadian government has done its level best to destroy any aspect of genuine patriotism in being a Canadian. They're doing the same thing that the Democrats are doing in the United States, where it's like, look at your history. What do you have to be proud of? You see this with Democrats all the time. When has America ever been great? America's never been great. They do the same thing in Canada. In fact, in some ways, they've done it like when you talk about like residential schools. Now, I'm not claiming that there weren't bad things that happened to the native population in Canada, just like there were in the United States.
Yeah, but they've done a ton of excavating and found nothing, right?
Well, that was the point I was about to make,
sorry.
right? Is that they made this claim that these residential schools had just like murdered, thousands of Indigenous kids. And then they were burning down churches in Canada as a result of this. And then they started doing the excavating and everything. I was like, oh, okay, well, we didn't find one. Now, again, I'm not saying it never happened, but when you're claiming that this is, when you're starting to make, TV shows, and I'm not talking about documentaries, I'm talking about just popular TV shows, that this is just a foregone conclusion that, of course, this happened all the time. And then it's actually having, really negative, effects. And then you find out that, oh, well, actually, we couldn't find evidence for at least the scope of the claims that we were making. I mean, dang.
Any evidence, any.
Yeah.
Like there's none. They couldn't excavate any of it. I got a question here, but before I say it, so the question was, that first one, it said, is from Darth Amalgamation, saying, is there any legitimate way we could prevent Canadians from voting in federal elections if we annex them? This is assuming that, like, there are portions of Canada that we would love to have vote with us, but here's the problem: is those are the same portions of Canada that probably really want to stay Canadian. Like, they're the ones that are still proud of being Canadian.
There is a growing secessionist movement in Alberta.
Yeah.
Is there?
Because they feel betrayed by their own government. They feel like it's not even feel. They know their money's being stolen from them, literally taken from them by force, and then given to the socialists in Quebec.
Yeah.
And Canada has the way that their government is structured is they have these like equalization payments. And so these like left-wing socialist provinces that love to live it up large on the taxpayer back, like Quebec, get money from Alberta, but then the politicians that Quebec sends to Ottawa will then vote against the economic interests of Alberta, who's sending them the money. So they will vote for things like blocking pipelines. They'll vote for things like carbon taxes. They will vote for things like preventing new drilling or new manufacturing or new mining or new economic development that would help a province like Alberta. And then they lecture the people of Alberta about how, well, we're morally upstanding good people because we care about climate change and you guys are contributing to the problem and we're going to punish you, at the same time that we're taking your money and we're taking your energy that's subsidized. And so the people of Alberta feel like that they're like, there's a reason that the trucker convoy was filled with Albertans that were coming to Ottawa. If you look at a map, those are not close.
It's not close. And everything is so far flung in Canada.
Well, Canada is the second largest country in the world.
So it's kind of ridiculous to think that you could centralize power in one portion of Canada and just all these people with very different, like so far flung. I mean, they're more spread out than we are.
90% of the population of Canada lives within like 50 miles of the U.S. border.
Yeah, but
like it's all like it's the
southern
strip of
they're
Canada.
Really far apart, from east to west.
Well, like the United States,
and very dispersed. I understand, but our numbers are much higher. But so back to the question of annexing and whether or not they would get the right to vote. And someone was asking if, let's see, it was Dan Teal was asking if they would, if it would be its own whole state, which would be kind of difficult, or if the northern states would just get expanded. In my opinion, it seems like it would make the most sense to annex all of it as sort of a territory and then allow certain provinces to petition for statehood and have them petition for statehood separately from the whole.
Well, it has to be that way.
Right.
So
it seems like Alberta could potentially become the state of Alberta.
Yeah, Canada wouldn't come in as one state. It's too
just
large.
be the state
it
of
would
Canada.
be individuals. Canada would come in as like multiple states.
And
Probably.
something tells me at that point, Quebec would just be like, we're going to be our own country.
Oh yeah, Quebec would never want to be part of it, and we honestly would not want them.
Well, just so everyone understands, right? The process for adding states to the United States is outlined in the admissions clause of the Constitution, which is Article 4, Section 3. This clause gives Congress the power to admit new states into the Union. The process is, 1, you petition Congress. So settlers on federal land can petition Congress to create a new territory. Congress acts. Congress can formally create a new territory or divide a territory into 2 political communities. 3, Congress admits the state. Congress can admit the new state into the Union. There's also rules on like you can't have a kingdom admitted into the, you can't have the kingdom of whatever, Maryland, and
they all need to have a Republican system of government.
Yeah, restrictions are new states cannot be formed within the jurisdiction of another state, which is an issue right now. New states cannot be formed by joining 2 or more states without the consent of Congress and the legislatures of the states involved. State governments must be Republican in form.
Right. So that
Canada
answers this other question. It says, going to ask it now. If America annexes Canada, sorry, I'm just sticking to the questions right now. Would their government still be a parliamentarian, or would they concede and embrace the constitutional republic? They would need to concede.
No, they could be a parliamentary system.
That's
totally
not
legal.
If they're going to be ours.
Yeah, if they join the U.S., they would totally be allowed to have a parliamentary system because that's consistent with the Republican form of government. They wouldn't have a monarch, but they would still have the Westminster unless they choose to.
They would still have to adopt our Constitution.
Well, okay, yeah, but the difference is when it says a Republican form of government, it essentially says that the state government that you establish has to feature a Republican form. Now, I actually think it's a more interesting question. I don't think it's as clear cut because one of the attributes of the Republican form within our system is very, very clear delineation between legislative and executive. And parliamentary governments do not have the same delineation between legislative and executive.
I have a feeling in a hypothetical situation where, say, Alberta joins the U.S., leave aside the rest of Canada for a minute, and Alberta wanted to keep their existing they have a premier, right? But I have a feeling that the Supreme Court would not tell Alberta that that's unconstitutional for them to keep their
I'm wondering. I'm not even
statehood political system.
I will say this. I don't think it's clear cut. Right. I think you could make an argument to say that, no, we don't have parliamentary systems.
Here's an example.
Wait a second. I think you could say we don't have parliamentary systems within the United States. And regardless, here's the other thing, regardless of whether or not it's constitutional, I think you would have members of Congress saying, I don't want that. I don't want my state deciding that it would be a good idea to adopt a parliamentary system. And if we start bringing states in with that sort of system, you start begging the question and potentially creating a different movement within the United States. I don't want a parliamentary system.
They might be able to do this if it stayed a territory and did not become states. Maybe then it's like this gray area, but then they wouldn't get any voting privileges in Congress from us.
So there are advantages and disadvantages to being a United States territory.
They wouldn't be able to vote in Congress.
You don't get to have representation within the federal government, or you can have. You're not. What do they make a distinction between delegate versus elected?
There's no voting power in Congress. There's no electoral votes for president. Yeah. But if you become a Commonwealth similar to Puerto Rico, you're exempt from things like the draft. I believe there's plenty of federal taxes that Puerto Rico is exempt from. And keep in mind, the other advantage of joining the U.S. is you become part of the largest market in the world.
Yeah.
Right? Without any immigration restrictions or trade restrictions. Alberta, for example, could ship all that oil into Montana and not have to deal with, Quebec-y leftists voting for carbon taxes and stuff like that.
There is a really interesting question real quick to tag on to that. Connor said, if America were to annex Canada, what sort of legal status would Canadians have? This is assuming they stayed a territory.
They'd be U.S. citizens.
Would certain provinces be eligible to apply for statehood? I think we covered that.
Yeah.
How would this affect visas and national defense? I think it would be just like what happens with some of these other territories.
You're still an American citizen.
Well,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're still an American citizen. It's just the difference.
So are Puerto Rican?
Yes.
Every Puerto Rican is an American citizen. Every resident of Washington, D.C., they don't have voting rights in Congress. They do have electoral votes because we passed an amendment. But if I move to D.C., I lose my ability to elect a member of Congress that can vote on legislation. I don't lose my citizenship, though.
Yeah.
And so if we annexed Canada and split it into, 20 states or whatever, 12 states, it probably wouldn't be the same number of provinces because their provinces
So they wouldn't
are huge.
need visas.
They would almost certainly, with the exception of maybe Alberta, start off as territories.
Yeah.
But they could potentially apply for statehood over time. I think that conservatives in the U.S. would be weary of admitting left-wing woke states into the union. And so we, as conservatives, would probably prioritize Alberta's ascension to statehood before we would Ontario's, but they would all be American citizens. And if I moved to Alberta, if it was part of the U.S., I would lose my ability to elect members of Congress, but I would still retain my citizenship. Likewise, if an Albertan, if Connor moved to Virginia, he could vote in Virginia elections because he would be an American citizen.
Question. If Quebec decided, no, we don't want any part of this and we just want to be our own territory. We don't even want to be part of the U.S. territory. And so if Quebec was taken completely out of the equation, would it be as far left? Would Canada be as far left?
No, not even. I mean, Canada would still be on the left, but it would not be even remotely as far to the left.
A follow-up question. This is very sticky. If Canada became part of the United States, okay, and, maybe some of the territories got statehood. Could the people born in Canada, even if it was before this transaction took place, so like Pierre, for instance, would he be eligible to run for president of the United States?
Yes, he would, for the same reason that historically, if you were born in a U.S. territory before that territory was given statehood, you under our Constitution, you would be considered a fully natural, not naturalized American citizen. If we admitted a state to the union, all the inhabitants of that state would be treated as if they were fully natural born citizens.
So you're saying
Canadians would be eligible to become president.
We could get Pierre as our president.
It would be extremely unlikely. I mean, we're talking about an unlikely scenario in general, but it is technically, if Canada was admitted to the union, again, I think that it would start off as a territory and it would be admitted individually as provinces. I don't think the whole country would come in as one state or one territory. I think Alberta would be its own state.
It would have to be broken up.
Manitoba would be its own state.
Let's talk about what could potentially be the most likely, and I don't think it's likely, but it's the most likely out of the available options. What you would have is maybe certain provinces, voting by referendum on whether or not they wanted to join the United States. You would have something of a crisis within the Canadian Parliament on whether or not they would allow that. Are they willing? And then, to what degree are they willing to allow it? Because in the United States, we have this debate, and then we had the Civil War, and at this point,
they almost had this in 1995.
Yes, when Quebec came very, very close to separating and becoming an independent country apart from Canada. So they already have something of a recent precedent within Canadian history for the self-determination and a legal process for separation. So I think it's actually easier on the Canadian side for various provinces to say, hey, we're down with this. And the little secret is Canada can't afford to lose Alberta. The Canadian economy, other provinces, Quebec specifically, but to some degree Ontario and others, they're dependent because I forget what the name of the process is. It's like equalization or something like that, where money comes into Canada and then the government redistributes it to the areas that they think need it more. But if Alberta, Saskatchewan, and maybe a couple others said, nope, we want to become U.S. territories, because that's what they would have to do. They would not, there's almost no scenario where they come in. I don't think there's any scenario where they come in directly as states. We'd have to first actually own the land, and then there would be a debate in Congress with respect to what's going to be admitted. And keep in mind, you're going to have a huge fight over that because of the composition of the Senate.
The last time that a state just came in as a state was California. Right. So we won the Mexican-American War, and it was like pretty much as soon as the ink was dried, California was a state.
But even then, so California was its own republic for about 6 months. And then very, very quickly, became a part of the United States. So the process can be expedited, but it generally still follows.
Texas as well came in as a state. It was an independent nation.
Republic for about 10 years.
Joined the U.S. and immediately became a state when it joined the U.S. Yeah. And so if Alberta broke off and declared independence, it probably would end up wanting to join the U.S. long-term because, again, it has a lot of resources that it wants to sell, right? And it's a landlocked territory.
Yeah.
And so if it became an independent nation, then it would have to pay taxes and tariffs to export anything into Canada and the U.S., especially because Alberta wouldn't inherit a free trade agreement with the U.S. And so I think that if you get Albertan secessionism is one step away from American statehood.
Yeah.
Which is why I think that it's more likely, it's also worth noting, that if you get one province that breaks off from Canada, Canada probably falls apart in very short order. And it doesn't matter which one breaks off first, right? Because, and this is where I was going with this, I think is more likely to happen is not Alberta seceding. I think it's more likely that Quebec secedes. And Canada can't function with, again, when you look at a map of Canada, Quebec splits the country in two. The maritime provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Labrador, and Newfoundland, or Newfoundland and Labrador, is separated physically and geographically by Quebec from the rest of Canada. Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, British Columbia, Yukon Territory, Nunavut. And so if Quebec broke off, Canada would be split in two physically, geographically, and that's
it's difficult.
It would create a domino effect most likely that would result in the country dissolving. Ultimately, though, I think that, and I'm curious if there's more questions.
There are more questions.
No, there's only one more question. I got to all the questions except for one.
Is this an important one to wrap with?
So what about parliamentary versus?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So someone asked, can you briefly explain the difference between a parliamentary system of government and an American Republican form of government? Because when we say a Republican form of government, that obviously, Rome had a very, very different Republican form of government than we do. But essentially, if you're looking at the primary components of the U.S. government, obviously we have a constitution, and then we have two components which are not exclusive to the United States, but very unique. One is very clear delineation of powers or separation of powers between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative. And then the other component to that is the federalist component between the federal government and the states. And so when you look at a parliamentary system, obviously parliamentary systems can still have provinces. They can still operate very, very similarly to the way that we do within our federalist system. But I would say that the biggest difference is the president within a parliamentary system is largely ceremonial. The chief executive is really the prime minister. Well, the prime minister is a member of the legislature. So you don't have the same separation of powers between the legislature and the executive that you do within our system. The other difference has to do with the way that in different parliamentary systems are different, right? But seat apportionment, things like that are different than our system. Generally, what you're voting for is the party, and then that party leader becomes the prime minister. So it's not as if you are not, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in most of these parliamentary systems, you are not directly voting for prime minister in the way that we directly vote for the president.
No, a lot of times it's the party members that elect the leader.
Yeah.
And depending on the system, it would be either the elected members of the legislature or literally the party members. So For example, Pierre was elected by the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
His previous successor, Aaron O'Toole, stepped down after the trucker convoy fiasco because he didn't take a strong enough stance on it. He was kind of like the Mitt Romney of Canadian politics. And Pierre was elected to replace him, and the Conservative Party ushered him in as their leader. And if his party wins, and they will win this election, he'll become prime minister. It's worth noting that we have... I am utterly convinced that a parliamentary form of government is completely legitimate under our Constitution, and the reason why is two. One, Nebraska only has one legislative chamber. They're a unicameral system. That's unique. And Nebraska used to have two chambers, and the people of Nebraska abolished the Nebraska House of Representatives back in the 1930s. They voted to do that.
Yeah.
You didn't have any court case saying you're not allowed to do that. You must have this type of system of government that we have in Washington, D.C. The federal government and the other states let Nebraska govern itself and leave it alone.
That's different than a parliamentary system.
The second thing is it's still a Republican system of government. It's a unicameral. Hang on. There's another analogy.
Unicameral versus bicameral is not the same departure as parliamentary. That's all I'm saying.
There is another example, which is, so we talk about division of powers between legislative, executive, and judicial. There are some states where there's arguably no division, there's only an artificial division between judicial and legislative. Virginia, our Supreme Court justices are not elected by the people. You elect them. As a member of the legislature. Whereas in Wisconsin, the Supreme Court members of the state of Wisconsin are elected statewide by the people. And so there's a different system there.
Again, the reason why this doesn't, but in the United States, I don't elect the Supreme Court.
But Nick, the point that I'm trying to say is, imagine a system where the legislature elected the governor. Because in Virginia, the legislature elects the Supreme Court. And we don't say that that's unconstitutional. We don't say that's not Republican. If the and that's one of the three branches.
So, Christian, we are fighting about something we don't need to be fighting about. You and I disagree about something. I think it is, you could very well be right. But the 2 points I made on this one is it is more of a departure. We have never had, to my knowledge, a state adopt a parliamentary system. That's not to say they couldn't make an effective argument that it falls within a Republican form of government, but there's no question that we have never had a state that has had that much of that little distinction between the legislative and the executive branches. Never. And so I think that would be taken into consideration on two counts. I think somebody might question the constitutionality of it, and they may very well lose that argument. I wouldn't be shocked if they won. I wouldn't be shocked if they lost. I'll put it that way. I could see arguments for both sides. But the other side of this that I do think would be significant is I think you would have a lot of people in the people that would get to make the decision on whether or not they admitted somebody with such a system would be the current members of Congress. And I think they would look very hard at, do we really want to admit a state with a parliamentary system? Does that cause issues? I mean, look at the fights going over things like, ranked choice voting.
Okay.
Right now you're going to add parliamentary versus this. I think that would be a much bigger issue. I think it would be,
okay, so I go back to this. I think because of how it would have to be somewhat broken up, it would be as a territory, and then these provinces don't have, I don't know how the province itself governs itself. Are they set up like states?
Yeah.
Okay, so
not entirely, but yes.
Because I don't think we would be allowing all of Canada to come in and be a Canadian state.
No, it wouldn't.
So it would be these individual ones, and they would have to set up their form of government. And so then they would just have to run whatever they planned through, whether or not it's constitutional or not, because they would have to comply with some of the things that are uniquely American. Somebody else also asked if we are going to do a podcast discussing Panama and Greenland.
So yeah, to answer your question on that one, I want to do the title of it I think is going to be the American Imperium. I want to
Pax Americana.
Yeah, I want to talk about what this. I want to talk about what it actually looks like if we actually saw a president with a more aggressive foreign policy, or if you saw some sort of issue, but a significant portion of that we'll be talking about what does this actually look like for Greenland, because Greenland I think is far more probable. Greenland and Panama are far more probable than anything happening with unification with Canada.
Yeah.
In part because I was making a joke the other day when I was talking to my colleagues in the General Assembly, and I said, "Hey guys, I think I'm going to, step down and be the Governor General of Greenland for Donald Trump." And I said I would actually represent fewer people than I represent now in the Virginia House of Delegates. But there's very significant strategic interest with respect to Greenland. Trump points out that it's not entirely clear that Denmark has as strong a claim on Greenland as it supposes. Macron in France has come out and said, "We would not allow this." Like, oh, okay, that's cute.
It's cute that they want to say allow.
It's cute that they would do that. And then the Panama again. There's always been some bitterness on the right about the fact that Jimmy Carter just kind of handed the Panama Canal back to Panama. Because if you don't know the history of that, this really started. There had always been.
We built that canal.
Well, we did more than just that. Desiring for there to be a Panama Canal had been something that had gone on for a long time. It predates U.S. or U.S. involvement. It's not like Teddy Roosevelt just came up with the idea and then decided to implement it. But originally, Panama was a part of Colombia, and they wanted to do a Panama Canal. Colombia did not want to permit the United States to do it, so the United States actually backed a Panamanian revolution against the Colombian government, supported Panama in becoming its own government, and then got the deal to make the Panama Canal. But the United States essentially administered it and ran it. And then
so that was basically payment for saving their butts.
Okay.
For creating them.
for creating them, yeah. And then the interesting part of that is again, obviously that was an incredibly strategic. It's arguably it's in the top 3 most strategic waterways in the world, and it's definitely the most strategic waterway for the United States. And the fact that we just kind of arbitrarily gave it back, and now the Chinese are largely responsible for administering key components of it is unacceptable on a number of levels.
I think a podcast discussing that, along with like various areas that the U.S. Is trying to have an effect in.
Yeah.
I mean, how about the fact that the Gulf of Mexico, we might be renaming the Gulf of America?
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes back to the broader discussion about foreign policy changes and the collapse of the Cold War, post-war liberal order. But specifically to just bring us back to Canada, I want to speak to our actual Canadian listeners, because we have a very large audience in Canada. Some of our most loyal listeners are Canadians.
Yeah.
Connor is a Canadian.
Yeah.
Right. Look, nobody at least here at this table. No, but I mean, I think, my country at large, I don't think any of us want to like take you guys over. Nobody in America is. I mean, okay, maybe Nick is.
I'm glad the camera wasn't on me right then. Like,
we don't want to. We're not going to invade you. We're not going to take you over. We view you guys as our friends. Like, we have a very shared history, common culture, common language for a long time, common religion. We fought in 2 world wars together. We've always, I mean, not always, of course, right? You go back to 1812 and 1776, but for over 100 years. We have been some of the closest neighbors and friends of any 2 countries in the entire world. That said, if there was ever a day where the Canadian people, I'm thinking specifically Alberta, Saskatchewan, maybe Manitoba, wanted to join the United States because they felt like that they weren't being listened to by Quebec and Ottawa.
Yeah.
I do think that if the people of Alberta wanted to join the U.S., we would welcome them. But that's a decision that you guys would have to make. It's not one that we can make for you, and it's not one that we can force on you.
Who would have thought Christian would be the soft one at this table when it came to
I say this as somebody that enthusiastically endorses the idea of us uniting.
I think it's
support
really
us
similar.
uniting, not annexation.
Yes,
I think there's a difference.
When Texas became a state, Texans retained a very strong sense of they're Texans.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is probably what would happen with Canada as well. Kind of, and Hawaii did the same thing. Very much still identified with their heritage in that location.
Yeah.
And so I think that's probably how that would go. But and there's a lot of salty Texans who feel like that their interests are watered down by the federal government. They really do. Texas has threatened to secede very like several times.
Well, one time
so.
Texas did, but I mean, I
Look,
don't think
I am all about adding ICE Texas to the union as Alberta. Well, to your point, right? Yeah, I don't believe it is morally justifiable to use military dominance to simply just take what you want. I won't lie that there is a part of me
that wants to go full empire.
There's a part of me,
because there's a part of me that wants that too.
There's a part of me that just looks around and it's like, gosh, I don't want to say full empire because that is not fundamentally.
We're going to rebuild the glory of Rome. We're the fourth Rome, Nick.
That's not fundamentally who I am. But but I'll put it this way: I understand the intriguing component of that. Of like, yes, the United States, we've got. Why shouldn't we have Cuba? And why should I understand that desire when you're looking at this purely as, almost like a video game, right? Where it's like, well, yeah, what are we going to do? We're going to go and we're going to bring law and order and we're going to bring economic opportunity and we're going to get rid of some of these, restrictions that don't allow us to flourish the way that we could. And we're going to solve some of the problems that exist in some of these places because quite frankly, without some sort of, it's very difficult to do so without somebody powerful enough to actually affect the sort of change that you need, right? That's all tempting. That's all tempting. And I know some people out there like, no, it isn't. And if it is tempting to you, then you're just a bad person. Whatever. I'm not saying we actually do it. What I'm saying is that.
Well, Trump isn't even saying to do it. He's saying he's going to use economic force to do it.
But again, if you look at all the places within our hemisphere, within our sphere of influence in the whole deal, right? There is something that I think would be, I can't help but think is kind of cool about the idea of the United States becoming, bigger and better and even greater and the idea that if people wanted to voluntarily join the United States to be a part of that mission, right, that effort, that culture. But I think the things that one of the things, and this could be something that Trump is trying to do to actually galvanize the American people, because I think for a long time, it's almost going back to that whole idea of the Jimmy Carter malaise, right? This feeling that we're just, I don't know, we're not on the ascendancy anymore. That's a common feeling within the United States, that we've lost something. And quite frankly, the left is all about us losing it because they don't like it and they want to rebuild it in their own image. And it's an image that bears no resemblance to what the United States was ever designed to be, with all of our flaws, designed to be. And when you start talking about like, well, no, hey, Canada, why don't you join the American nation and the experiment that is incorporated within that? And then we can remove some of these barriers that currently standing in our way of being, more prosperous and more secure. There's something very appealing about that. And again, I don't want to achieve it through brute military force, but to the extent that you would have places like Alberta that would want to join the United States, that would be hugely beneficial for both parties. Hugely beneficial. And to Tina's point, one of the things that has been interesting about the United States is that both from a domestic component, and that's the part where Texans are very proud of being Texans, right? There is no doubt that there is a Texas culture that is not the same as other states. Same thing with Hawaiian culture, and you can argue this in other areas as well. There's regional components to our republic that still take a great deal of pride in their regional component, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a negative attribute of the United States. There's also an international component where there's people that have come to the United States from other countries who still greatly appreciate their heritage, but are also very proud to be Americans. It was one of the components of American culture that was so powerful, is that you didn't have to reject your heritage, but you were adopting America, and America was adopting to you, and you are part of that family now. You weren't living here in isolation from that. And so I would love to get back to a point where we still believe in that, and we embrace that. And it would be great to work with other people that also believe in that as well and want to be a part of it. And so I think to some degree it's a hopeful message, right? But it will be interesting to see how it plays out, because I agree. I think we're all agreed at this table. There's no way that Canada does not become the 51st state. That makes no sense.
That's a short form statement for a much more complicated topic.
Yes, it would be individual provinces potentially breaking away, becoming independent, going through the process of statehood with the United States, others recognizing that it's in their best interest to do the same. And potentially
We could end up with
that.
like 3 extra states.
Probably more than that if we
it would
took
probably
Canada.
be more than that. But then that creates huge questions within the United States with the composition of the Senate, with the composition of the House. Like there's a lot of questions that go into this. It's not a simple process. The territorial one kind of is. Right, the territorial one is nowhere near as difficult to figure out here, especially if you see a province like Alberta that said, we want to become a U.S. territory. We would still like to maintain that. And then we would like to gradually over time, entertain the idea of full statehood and incorporation into the Union. And that would be an interesting discussion, because once you open it up for one, and keep in mind, that's significant because it'd be 51. Right? That's significant for how this impacts decision-making. Part of the reason why we fought the Civil War was because of how the introduction of free states and slave states impacted the Senate. So those battles are going to come about. But the idea of the United States once again expanding, not through military force, but because it was in the best interest of the parties involved, that's kind of exciting to think about, that the world could change in that way and potentially be better as a result of it. Because one thing I do think is going to happen, whether we like it or not, is the post-World War II and the post-Cold War era of this idea that borders just
never change,
except to disintegrate borders of larger countries in order to make them smaller ones, is not sustainable. Especially not in a world where, and Europe is finding this out. And Macron can say whatever he wants, but it's like, Macron, your problem is not your problem is not 56,000 Greenlanders deciding that they'd rather be Americans. Your problem is that despite the fact that you have a higher GDP than Russia, you are completely dependent on the United States for your security. So here's an idea, sport. Why don't you and your middle school teacher focus a little bit more on how you're going to deal with the internal problems of France, rather than worrying about what 56,000 Greenlanders want to do. Because quite frankly, whether you like it or not, there's nothing you can do about it, because you have lived under the blanket of U.S. military dominance for so long that you forget that your ability to impose your will is completely dependent upon American military power. And it turns out we're not all that interested in what you think about us.
Yeah, you're not Louis the 14th.
Yeah,
you don't get to impose your will on anyone.
You are not a player in this game anymore, because leftists like you have so disintegrated a patriotic fervor within your own country, the overall composition and culture within your own country. You have disintegrated ultimately the military capacity of your country, because you wanted to emphasize a welfare state over actually doing the things the governments are supposed to do in order to ensure sovereignty.
Also, keep in mind all the endless apology for colonialism and empire.
So guess what, Sparky? You find yourself in a position where nobody cares what you have to say, because it turns out that without genuine economic and military power, you getting offended doesn't mean anything.
If there was a tweet from somebody that I read a few days ago that was like, as we've learned in Ukraine, just because high-minded people disapprove of certain things on the world stage doesn't mean that they don't happen.
Yeah.
That goes back to your point about how the era of looking at a map and saying these borders can never change, that seems to be coming to an end very quickly now.
Yeah.
And we're entering into a new era. And something must be said. I know that we will do a podcast on this in more detail in the future, but something must be said about foreign relations and how in the U.S. in particular, and in other countries as well, but in the U.S. in particular, the debate was always about neoconservatism versus non-interventionism or isolationism. And I see so many people now that are saying Trump is a neocon because he's talking about annexing Canada or Greenland or the Panama Canal. No, he's not.
Yeah.
You're using old thinking, and we're entering a new world, a new era. The debate is not neoconservatism versus isolationism or non-interventionism, in part because you're misunderstanding what neoconservatism is. These people are applying a definition of neoconservatism to say any use of aggressive force or economics to pursue a country's interest is neoconservatism. By that logic, Genghis Khan is the greatest neocon who ever lived.
Yeah.
No, neoconservatism is something very specific, and it's not simply using force, military or otherwise, to pursue a country's interests. Neoconservatism is the use of force in pursuing an ideology. It is using the United States' hard and soft power to promote liberalism. It's using regime change and military interventionism to spread liberalism to other parts of the world. That's what nation building is.
Yeah.
Using military force to pursue gender programs in Afghanistan is not the same thing as growing the United States. By that logic, Julius Caesar grew Rome. He was a neocon? No, he wasn't. He was an imperialist.
Yeah.
But he was not a neocon. And so the debate that we now have is not neoconservatism spreading an ideology and using a country's resources, our country's resources, to do that, versus non-interventionism or isolationism. The debate is now between realpolitik versus Weltpolitik. This is the debate that the German Empire had in the early 20th century.
Yep.
And there are strong and negative sides of both of those positions. But that is an entirely different framework than the one that we have previously been in. And people need to get out of old forms of thinking, and ironically enough, go back to even older forms of thinking. But they need to understand that we're entering a new era. And so when Trump talks about things like Greenland or Canada or the Panama Canal, stop thinking about neocon versus isolationism and start thinking about realpolitik versus Weltpolitik, because that is really what we're moving into now.
Yeah, no, I think that's, again, I want to do an episode very soon on that one. There's some other work, there's some other projects that we're going to be considering and doing a little bit more in depth, I think, going into 2025. We want to do a lot more with respect. We want to do some consistent shows, not as part of our Tuesday, Thursday, but maybe looking at a third show that we could be doing where we're focusing a lot on Doge Watch, because that's going to be critical over the next couple of years. But I really do want to sit down and have this discussion about, again, I'm going to call it the American Imperium simply because I think it's a provocative title, not because I necessarily want one, but because I do think you're right. I think we're moving past, I will say this, I don't think we're moving past all of the constraints of the post-World War II or post-Cold War dynamic. I don't think we're moving past all of them. But I think there's certain things that have been considered sacred for so long that people are now starting to look around, and you have new generations going, why is this here? And they might be starting to rip up fence posts. And again, the Macron response to all of that is going to be grossly offended. How dare you? And then he's going to look around and be like, oh, I don't have any way to stop this. No, you don't. So, maybe you should start thinking about that and instead of making veiled threats at superpowers you can't contend with. And I don't say this as someone that has any direct animosity toward France. I think France has an incredible and rich history. I just think it's been ruled by idiots for too long. Anyways.
So what's your closing message to the Canadian people?
So here's my closing message to the Canadian people. Look, I don't think you have anything to fear with a military invasion of your lands. Donald Trump has already said, look, we don't, and I believe this, we have no right to Canadian territory. However, we do believe the Canadians have right to self-determination. And should certain Canadians discover that they can be a part of the American nation and experiment while at the same time appreciating attributes of their own cultural heritage and embracing what it means to be an American, I think that you would find a number of your brothers and sisters to the South would be very, very interested and would welcome you with open arms, provided that it is understood that to become an American means to embrace American culture, systems, and ideas, while at the same time showing appreciation for the ones that you currently have. So all I would say to most of Canada, Quebec, you can do your own thing. But to the rest of Canada, and especially Alberta, again, I am here. I'm going to say right now, I fully endorse, Snow Texas. That's what I'm calling Alberta now. Snow Texas would be a great addition to the United States. Well, anyways, we hope you all found this very interesting. I want to thank the various members of the audience we have that are Canadian or originally Canadian and now American citizens for their insight and their detailed knowledge of the various things going on with Canada that have informed this discussion. Once again, if you want to be a part of the live chat, please go to the link in the description. Check out our intentional community. There's a lot of things that we do over there, a lot of things that we provide for our members, and even more that we're looking to provide for them going into 2025. So there's never been a better time to go check that out. And it is one of the best ways that you can support the show. Also, on top of that, please check out the people that advertise with us, because look, they take a risk to advertise with us. They do. Right. We talk about some controversial topics, and we certainly don't hold back. We know Tina doesn't. Right. So, and yet, not only have our advertisers been great, and not only do they provide great products, but they have re-upped. They have stuck with us. We've had some controversial shows the last couple of months, and we've even had some times where we've wondered if we weren't being throttled a bit. And yet, our advertisers, Good Ranchers, True Classic, they come back and continue to work with us, and so we're very grateful to them both. Go check out their stuff. You will not be dissatisfied. You will be very happy. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.